The air in the Aegis Convergence Hub tasted of cracked carbon and panic, but Commander Elias Vance wasn't focused on the gunfire vibrating through the deck plates. He was focused on the cold, trembling fingers pressed hard against his temples. Princess Lyraine's eyes were squeezed shut, her pale skin illuminated by the harsh, strobing emergency lights. When her mind crashed into his, it wasn't a clean, clinical connection. It was a flood. He felt her buried, terror-tight and suffocating. She felt his stubborn, heavy pulse, the adrenaline burning in his veins. They were supposed to be coordinating security forces against the Null faction mercenaries breaching the doors. Instead, it was the first time either of them truly breathed the same air. It hadn't started with shared minds and desperate survival. Truth is, it started with an arrogant diplomatic insult that sparked a high-stakes matrimonial wager. 3 weeks earlier, the hub's banquet hall had been suffocatingly polite. The Taurans desperately needed favorable trade parameters with the Kalan ascendancy. But Lyrarine had stood at the center of the delegation, her voice carrying effortlessly over the crystal glasses, publicly dismissing Terran intelligence as primitive. They were loud children, she implied, playing with stars they couldn't possibly comprehend. Elias hadn't raised his voice when he pushed his chair back and stood. He had simply offered a challenge. If he could unlock the Ascendancy's most sacred, unsolved, ancient puzzle device, she would offer her hand in marriage to a Terran. If he failed, Earth would swallow severe, crippling trade sanctions for a decade. The room had gone dead quiet. Lyrien had smiled a cold, sharp expression and handed him the heavy, metallic box. She thought he would use algorithms, scanners, mathematics, but Elias just held it. He closed his eyes, ignoring the collective sneers of the Kalan elite. He felt the faint, rhythmic thrum of the metal against his palms, tracing the microscopic shifts in its surface. He manipulated the mechanisms using non-logical, tactile movements. He pushed where the metal felt warm. He twisted where the internal resistance subtly yielded. And then a heavy click echoed through the hall. The impossible ancient artifact opened. It didn't just unlock. It projected hidden Kalan historical records into the center of the room. Holographic truths mapping a past where the Ascendancy hadn't always been so isolated and rigid. It held the blueprint for galactic parity, exposing the forgotten vulnerabilities of a deeply stagnant political machine. Lyrine's shock had been absolute, stripping the arrogance from her posture. But she was Kalan royalty. She honored the terms. The resulting interspecies wedding ceremony was a blur of heavy ceremonial fabrics and silent judging stares. They were legally bound, but entirely strangers. She kept to the far side of their shared quarters. He gave her space. The gap between them was wide and freezing, until the hub's alarms screamed. The Null faction didn't care about diplomacy or royal marriages. They wanted the hub destroyed, which brought Elias back to the cold floor of the command center, his wife's hands gripping his skull as the blast doors groaned under enemy fire. The telepathic link solidified. Suddenly, he wasn't just barking orders into a comms unit. He was pushing his raw military tactical knowledge directly into her consciousness. She took his strategic instinct and broadcast it flawlessly to the pinned-down security forces across the sector. They moved as one unified entity, a perfect synthesis of human grit and Kalan mental architecture. In the quiet space of his mind, Elias felt her sudden awe. She felt his absolute, unwavering trust. The assault was neutralized in minutes, the mercenaries outmaneuvered by a defense grid acting with impossible coordination. When Lyrien finally pulled her hands away, she gasped, staring at Elias as if seeing him for the first time. Her chest heaved. The ice was gone. In its place was something fragile and terrifyingly real. But the survival of the hub was only the beginning. The real war was waiting for them back on her homeworld. It turned out the Kalan homeworld was exactly as cold as its people. The towering crystalline structures offered no warmth, only sharp, judging angles. And Warlord Vorith was the sharpest of them all. Vorith didn't wait for diplomatic pleasantries. He met their transport with armed guards and a fabricated charge of treason. Falsified historical records, Voreth claimed, planted by a Terran spy to incite an interstellar war. The guards ripped Elias away from Lorene. He felt the sudden, violent absence of her presence in his mind. Her eyes widened, but she didn't scream. She just looked at him, a silent promise. His holding cell was an immaculate box of humming energy fields. But Voreth underestimated human desperation. The Kalan relied on flawless systems. Elias relied on friction and flaws. He stripped a wire from his uniform's internal heating coil, bypassing the field emitter with a brutal, sparking short circuit that left his fingers blistered. The pain grounded him. He crawled through the underground maintenance infrastructure for hours. The air down there was stale, thick with dust. His muscles burned. He kept his mind locked on the memory of Lorraine's touch to push through the exhaustion until he reached the heavy doors of the Imperial Archives. The archives were guarded by telepathic wards, designed to scramble the mind of anyone without royal Kalan blood. Elias pressed his hands against the cold metal door. He closed his eyes. He didn't try to hack it. He remembered. He pulled up the exact sensation of Lorraine's mind from the hub attack, the weight of her trust, the shape of her thoughts. The system felt the echo of her within him. It yielded. He downloaded the authentic data just as the High Council convened to sentence him in absentia. When Elias pushed through the heavy doors of the council chamber, the hush was absolute. He didn't waste time on speeches. He slammed the drive into the central projector, exposing a buried imperial history to stop an orchestrated interstellar war was the only play left. Holograms flooded the room, not the falsified Terran threats, but Voreth's own localized commands, detailing his decades-long effort to keep this a stagnant empire. The truth of their past built on cultural synthesis, not isolation, glowed in the air. Voreth lunged. He didn't go for Elias. He went for Liran, his blade drawing a low hum from the air. But Liran was already moving. She didn't use diplomacy. She stepped inside Voreth's guard and drove her palm into his chest, flooding his nervous system with a paralyzing telepathic strike. Voreth dropped, rigid and gasping. Liran didn't look at her uncle. She looked across the room at Elias. Her chest heaved. The space between them collapsed. The council had no choice. Voreth was formally exiled before the day ended, and the doors of the Empire were finally forced open. 5 years later, the air on the new cooperative space station smelled like blooming flora and circulated warmth. Elias leaned against the railing of the station's park. Below them, a multi-species youth group chased a glowing ball through the grass, laughing in a dozen different languages. Lorene stood beside him, her shoulder pressed firmly against his. He reached down, resting his hand over the heavy curve of her pregnant belly. She placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm. They had built this institute to teach the galaxy what they had learned in blood and silence. Truth is, systemic arrogance could only be broken by humility and collaboration. Trust wasn't negotiated at a table. It was earned in the dark, when everything else was stripped away. Elias felt a soft, rhythmic kick against his palm. He looked at his wife. She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. They didn't need words. They already knew exactly what the other was feeling.